All right, in lecture 5, we're talking about the other end of the spectrum, not purely competitive, but pure monopoly. And monopoly, we can actually think about the board game Monopoly. The goal of the game of Monopoly is to own all of the tiles or all of the land pieces. And so Monopoly is exactly the same. We see a single owner of a firm that controls all of the property or all of the product in the market. All right, so for our example, when we're thinking about a monopoly, a few years ago I took a vacation, and out in the middle of Nevada is what they call the loneliest road in America, and there's nothing for hundreds of miles in either direction. Next service station, 109 miles. And so what we have here is a gas station that has a monopoly. There is one single seller of gas and even of convenience store items for hundreds of miles. There are no close substitutes. If you want to have a substitute, you have to have some gas in your vehicle. That would be the closest substitute, which isn't realistic for most people. And so what we have here is a pure monopoly. We have one gas station supplying the service needs for hundreds of miles, no close substitutes existing. All right, so let's go through each of those characteristics that we're going to compare our different market types on. So first, the number of sellers. There's a single seller. There's only one seller in this market, and the sellers then can determine the price. So the sellers have the ability to set their price. There's not that competition that we saw in our purely competitive market where there's many firms selling tomatoes. There's one seller selling the product, and since that's the case, they have the ability to set the price, as opposed to in that purely competitive market where they were able, where they didn't have the ability to control the price. They were price takers. They had to set it at the market price. And when we have a pure monopoly, there are barriers to entry. So there's some reason why we don't see more firms entering into the market. And so for some reason, there's these strong barriers that don't allow new entrants into the market that are allowing this one firm to be the only seller of the product. Again, there's no close substitutes or other brands for the product. So in some instances, it might be multiple brands. In other instances, it would be if there was some sort of substitute, if there was something other than gasoline that I could use to power my vehicle that I could use instead. But in this case, there were no close substitutes, no other brands, no similar products that can be used to replace that monopoly product. And since we can see that these firms have the ability to have some control over the price, then they can exhibit price discrimination. And we're going to talk about what exactly price discrimination is. But price discrimination is going to be the ability of these firms to differentiate based on people's willingness to pay, and they're going to charge different consumers different prices. So again, we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but let's first talk about those barriers to entry. So there's something that's preventing new firms from entering into this market, and that's what we refer to as a barrier to entry. There are no new firms coming into the industry, and a couple of these could be due to economies of scale. And this is why this is my argument, I would say, for this sole gas station on this highway. New firms have a difficult time entering into the market due to high fixed costs. So to open another gas station requires a lot of fixed costs. We have to build the building, we have to get the pumps, we have a lot of fixed costs to set up a new business, and there isn't a lot of demand. It's called the loneliest road in America for a reason. There's not a lot of people driving on it, and so there's not a lot of demand for the product. So the economies of scale is one reason why we might see barriers to entry in a market. Next, legal barriers, patents and licenses. In the United States, when somebody invents a new product, when they invent a new drug, we see that the United States government places a legal barrier on entry into the market. They prevent for X number of years anyone from producing that same product, replicating that product. And this is in order to have a research and design type of incentive. It keeps firms innovative. It allows there to be some sort of benefit for being innovative in the market. Next, ownership of an essential resource. And we're going to talk about it in just a minute. but De Beers controls the great majority of diamond mines, and since they own the essential resource, it allows them to prevent new entrants into the diamond market. Since they own the majority of diamond caves, there isn't a lot of ability for new firms to enter into the market. So barriers to entry, because there's some sort of essential resource that other firms that's not allowing other firms to enter into the market. And then finally, pricing schemes. So this is a common complaint we hear when we're thinking about Walmart. Some people complain Walmart comes into a new town, they slash their prices really low to get the existing businesses out of business, and then they increase their prices. And whether or not Walmart really does that or not is up for debate, but it is one argument on how a company might create a barrier. So they hear a firm is going to enter into the market, they slash their price, they have the ability to do that, so they cut their price for the time being until that worry is gone, and then they increase their prices again. So pricing schemes can allow for some sort of barrier to entry. All right, so all of these creating that difficult for new firms to enter into the market, giving that existing firm power over not only the price today, but also in the price in the future. So new firms have that inability to enter into the market. The seller prefers higher prices, and they could charge the price that they want, which means it's going to be higher. So monopoly is often going to charge higher prices than if we're in a perfectly competitive market, where firms are competing for your business, driving down the price to make it more affordable for consumers. When there's only one firm in the market, they're going to prefer a higher price, and they're going to set that price higher. So next we're going to talk about price discrimination. And I mentioned this before, but since monopolies have the ability to make prices, they're not price takers, they're price makers, they have that control, and they can charge different buyers different prices. So why might they do this? Well, one reason that they might charge different buyers different prices is because people have different willingness to pays. So let's think about the bookstore. So South Carolina has a bookstore, has all kinds of different Gamecock gear within the bookstore. They provide, and you have a willingness to pay for a Gamecock sweatshirt. And let's say your willingness to pay for that Gamecock sweatshirt is $50, but I'm only willing to pay $40. So if they charge $45, you'll buy the sweatshirt and I won't. But if the bookstore knew that you had a higher willingness to pay than I did, then they might charge us different prices. And that's actually exactly what they do. Faculty get a discount for purchasing something at the bookstore. So I go in, I show my faculty ID, and I get a discount. And that's because they know that faculty have a different willingness to pay relative to students. Students, you decided to go to University of South Carolina because you are a hardcore Gamecocks fan. And so they know that you have a higher willingness to pay for that Gamecock gear than the faculty. So they charge you the higher price. I show my Gamecock ID, and then I get the Gamecock sweatshirt for the lower price. They are still making that profit because they were able to charge you $45 and me $40, and now we both bought the product. Before, only you were buying the product, and so this allows the company or the monopoly to start to take more of those profits in for themselves. So since monopolies have the ability to set the price, if they know the different people's willingness to pay for a product, they have the ability to charge different buyers different prices. The key to price discrimination is that price differences are not based on cost differences. So when we're thinking about this Gamecock sweatshirt, it costs the bookstore the exact same amount to sell the sweatshirt to you as it did to me. There was no cost difference. However, there were price differences. This isn't true, so another example would be an all-you-can-eat buffet. There's an adult price and there's a kid's price. Kids' prices are traditionally going to be lower than the adult price. And those are not price discrimination because they're based on cost differences. An adult will eat more off the buffet than a child will. And so it's going to cost the restaurant different amounts. That's why they charge different prices. So that would not be an example of price discrimination. In an example of price discrimination, another example might be movie theater tickets where there's a kid's price and an adult's price. The kid and the adult both take up one seat each. They cost the movie theater the same amount of money, but there's a price difference. The difference not based on cost differences. So if the child pays $4 less than the adult, even though it costs the movie theater the same amount, that is price discrimination. Okay, again, the goods cost the firm the same amount to produce. The difference is not based on cost difference, but only a difference in the willingness to pay. So again, sellers must be able to identify or group buyers based on their willingness to pay. So faculty, students, adult, child. And a couple of things that are required to make this work is the seller also must be able to somehow screen to identify. I have to show my faculty ID. The child has to look like a child, or otherwise they're not allowed to receive that rate. And so those parts are important to being able to successfully price discriminate. Some other here's some more. Conditions for success, which we have talked about, must have some control over price, must have the ability to segment the market into one group that has a higher willingness to pay and one group that has a lower willingness to pay. So the students have the higher willingness to pay, faculty have the lower willingness to pay, and the product cannot be resellable. So in the case of the sweatshirt, I guess I could really buy the sweatshirt for $40 and then sell it to you for $43. You would get $2 off. I get an extra $3. So I guess that's technically allowable, but we don't see that traditionally happening in the faculty-student dimension there. But on the movie theater example, it's not resellable. A child cannot go up, buy a seat, and then give their ticket to an adult who then gets the discount. So in order to successfully price discriminate, the product can't be resellable. All right, some other examples of price discrimination: flights. So airlines price discriminate against business travelers versus vacationers. So they try to offer vacationers a lower price relative to business travelers. Business travelers have set days that they need to travel. They aren't as concerned about prices. They have higher willingness to pay. Whereas vacationers, they can be a little more flexible and they don't want to pay as much for their trip. And so what we see are airlines, based on the day that you book your flight or the type of seat that you purchase, they might charge you extra. And that's because they know business travelers have a higher willingness to pay. Utilities, peak hour extra charges. So even though it costs the same amount to provide electricity all day long, during peak hours, a utility company might charge extra. And even though it costs the same amount, it's differentiating based on those hours that people are consuming electricity. Coupons. People who seek out those discounts have a lower willingness to pay than those who don't. So we might go to the same restaurant, have the same thing to eat, but you have a coupon and I don't, and all of a sudden you are paying less for something than I am, even though the cost of restaurant the same amount to produce. And so those who are willing to seek out coupons have a lower willingness to pay than those who don't. And this is kind of a reverse price discrimination. I shouldn't use the word reverse, but you'll see when I start to describe it. Post office. It costs the same price to send a letter across the street as it does across the country. So what we see here is that it's charging the same price, but it's costing the firm a different amount. So it costs the U.S. Postal Service different amounts to send a letter across the street compared to across the country, relative, even though they're charging the same price. So it costs, I don't even know what the price of a stamp is now, but let's say it costs 50 cents to send a letter. It costs you 50 cents to send a letter down the street to pay your electricity bill, as it does to send the letter to your grandma across the country. It's going to cost the post office very different amounts to provide that service, but they charge the same price. So this is price discrimination slightly in reverse. It's cost differences, but those cost differences don't reflect price differences. All right, so a quick quiz. Let's think about competitive markets versus monopolies. And so, darn it, I realized that I just gave my example away for my price discrimination, but how would you classify the market for milk? Suppose a firm is prevented from entering a market due to a patent. This market closely resembles a, and then offering a child's price for a all-you-can-eat buffet versus a movie theater ticket are these examples of price discrimination. So pause now, and then we'll go over those. All right, so hopefully you've taken some time to think about these questions. How would you classify the market for milk? So when you go into the grocery store, there are many different brands of milk, and even across grocery stores, or even thinking about where you can get milk, there are many different sellers of milk. The brands of milk, there are different brands, but there isn't much difference. A gallon of milk is a gallon of milk. The quality difference, not very much there. A generic brand versus a name brand, they're all pretty similar. And the prices are also very similar across grocery stores and across locations. And so I would classify the market for milk as a purely competitive or a very competitive market. It might not be perfectly competitive, but it's definitely over there. It's further closer to a purely competitive market than it is a monopoly, based on the number of sellers, the price, the similarity in prices, and the similarity in product and quality. So the market for milk, very similar to what you would think of when you would think of a purely competitive market. Suppose a firm is prevented from entering a market due to a patent. This market closely resembles a monopoly. Remember, a patent is going to be a legal barrier to entry, and that's going to cause a monopoly for a time being. After that patent is removed, it's going to move away from a monopoly and it maybe towards an in-between market before we get to that purely competitive market. But when we have a patent, the market most closely resembles a monopoly. And then finally, offering a child's price for an all-you-can-eat buffet is not price discrimination. It's not price discrimination because it's going to cost the restaurant a different amount for an adult as it will a child. However, for a movie theater, it costs the child and the adult the same, it costs the firm the same amount to have that individual in the seat. However, a child receives that reduced price. And so the movie theater ticket price, that is an example of price discrimination. All right, so hopefully you've gotten these questions correct. For more practice, make sure you check out the More Practice